The woman who learned to sleep with the universe. What if I told you, sleep isn't just rest? It's a language. A code. And one woman decoded it. Eliana wasn't searching for peace. She was chasing patterns, signals, science. But the deeper she looked, the louder the silence became. Strange symbols appeared in her research. Dreams started speaking in vibrations. And a single message kept returning. Sleep is not escape. It's alignment. In a world that worships productivity, Eliana dared to surrender. And what she found was a rhythm deeper than breath. A silence more musical than sound. And a code written not in words, but in soul. This isn't just a story. It's a journey into the heart of stillness. A scientific experiment turned spiritual awakening. Where data turned to dreams. And one woman disappeared, not into death, but into the rhythm of the stars. Stay with me till the very end. Because once you hear the final signal, you'll never look at sleep the same way again. The whisper in the leaves. In the quiet hum of a secluded forest lab nestled deep within the Adirondack Mountains, Dr. Alara Miles adjusted her round spectacles and leaned closer to a mossy leaf under the lens of her microscope. Outside, the pine trees swayed in a slow, ancient rhythm, their branches creaking like old bones. The faint scent of cedar and loam crept through the cracked window, mingling with the delicate rustle of parchment notes strewn across her desk. She had been chasing whispers, tiny patterns in the veins of leaves, the spiral of sunflower seeds, and the flickering bioluminescence of fireflies. These were not just accidents of nature, she believed, but messages, codes embedded in the living world, too subtle for ordinary eyes to see. While her colleagues focused on neural maps and genetic blueprints, Alara had turned her gaze outward, to forests, fungi, even the way morning dew formed on a spider's web. This particular evening felt different. Her mind was foggy, not with confusion, but with a kind of dreamy anticipation. As she peered through the scope, she noticed a repetition in the chlorophyll clusters of a leaf. Not random. Not natural. It was a fractal sequence, a pattern she had seen in galaxies, waves, and frost. Her breath caught in her throat. Could it be? She reached for her notebook, flipping to a diagram she'd drawn months ago while half asleep, swirls of numbers and spirals that had come to her in a dream. Her hand trembled slightly as she began tracing over the sketch again. Nature, she whispered, is trying to tell us something. A slow rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The lab's old radio fizzled softly, and a faint melody, somewhere between wind chimes and static, drifted through the air. It was as if the forest itself had begun to hum in unison with her heartbeat. She didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a journey that would take her far beyond the borders of what science had ever dared to imagine. From the patterns in petals to the hidden frequencies of roots, she was about to unlock a secret language, one that nature had been speaking all along. And the first word had just been whispered in the leaves. The final entry. The world had gone quiet. Eliana stood alone in the lab. The same space that once buzzed with electricity, data, theories, now felt like a sanctuary. Not because it had changed, but because she had. Her research files were complete. Every chart, every line of code, every unexplained pattern was now still. Waiting. She opened her notebook. Not the digital one, the real one. Paper. Ink. Something personal. Human. With trembling hands, she wrote. This is my last entry. Not because there's nothing more to find, but because I've finally stopped searching. The answers were never out there. They were inside the silence. Inside me. A soft hum filled the room. Not from the machines, they had shut down. This sound was deeper. Like the universe had begun to breathe. She placed the notebook beside her. Took one long breath. And laid down, not to die, but to listen. The ceiling above her looked like a sky. And in that moment, Eliana wasn't a scientist. She wasn't a researcher. She wasn't lost. She was just ready to surrender, to rest, to sleep. But this time, with peace. The forest's silent signal. The rain had started softly, first as a hush across the leaves, then gathering into a rhythm that thudded gently against the lab's tin roof. Dr. Elara Miles stood by the window, cradling a mug of lavender tea, her gaze fixed beyond the misted glass into the dense, living forest. The patterns she'd found last night still danced in her mind, spirals within spirals, leaf veins echoing constellations. She had always believed the world was woven with intelligence, not only in creatures with brains, but in the very roots of trees, the curvature of petals, and the winding of rivers. Still, it had never struck her so vividly, so deeply, as it did now. That fractal sequence in the mossy leaf, it wasn't coincidence. It was a message. Downstairs, the motion-sensitive camera she had installed in the grove behind the lab buzzed softly. Curious, Elara padded down the creaking steps in thick socks, her tea in hand. The screen blinked to life, showing the small clearing near the old birch. There, in the rain, something stirred, a slow ripple through the underbrush, not quite animal, not quite breeze. The moss had begun to glow. Faintly. Subtly. A pale emerald shimmer pulsing in deliberate intervals. Heart quickening, she threw on her coat and stepped outside, umbrella forgotten. The world felt electric, not in a loud, stormy way, but in the way air feels just before a violin string is plucked. Every sound, raindrop, owl, distant rustle, was sharper, as if the forest were holding its breath. She reached the glowing patch, crouched low, and brushed the moss with the tip of her finger. The pulsing slowed, then matched the rhythm of her breath. Her skin tingled. This moss was responding to her. Elara's mind reeled. Was this bioluminescence? Electrical signaling? Or something else entirely, something older, more intentional? She remembered reading about mycorrhizal networks, how fungi help trees communicate underground. But this felt personal. Back in the lab, soaked and exhilarated, she analyzed a tiny clipping from the moss under her microscope. The chloroplasts flickered in complex intervals, Morse-like, purposeful. Not just light, language. She began writing again, filling her notebook with symbols, patterns, and questions. Sleep was out of the question now. She was deep in the forest's current, no longer observing, but participating. The code was unfolding, not in textbooks, but in living, breathing green. And for the first time in her career, Dr. Elara Miles understood, she was no longer just a scientist. She was a translator. The language beneath the leaves. Elara awoke the next morning to birdsong woven with soft rain and the scent of damp earth drifting through her open window. She had fallen asleep at her desk, notebook cradled to her chest, the pages ink-stained with spirals, dots, and trembling lines. Her dreams had been unlike any before, glowing vines whispering riddles, tree roots shifting like script beneath the forest floor, and the unmistakable sensation of being watched by something ancient and kind. Stretching slowly, she stood and walked barefoot to the window. Outside, the forest looked as it always did, green and lush, humming with hidden life. But now, she saw it differently. The patterns in bark, the arrangement of petals, the flight of a moth, all seemed to pulse with meaning. She dressed quickly and set out into the woods, camera and notebook in hand. Each step along the mossy path felt guided, as if the forest had laid it just for her. The grove from the night before had changed. The moss, no longer glowing, had left behind tiny crystalline threads, each as fine as spider silk and faintly iridescent. As she knelt beside them, Elara felt a vibration through the earth, low, like a distant hum. Not sound exactly, but sensation. She placed her palm flat on the ground. There it was again. A frequency, a resonance, like a heartbeat. Or a voice trying to be heard without words. She remembered a lecture she'd once given on how trees communicate through chemical signals and root networks. But this felt like more than chemical. This felt like intent. Her thoughts were interrupted by movement behind her. She turned quickly, expecting a deer or perhaps a fox, but saw nothing. Just a sudden breeze stirring the trees in a slow, deliberate wave, as though they were nodding in greeting. Elara. She froze. That voice. Whisper light, neither male nor female. Not loud, but present. Spoken directly into her mind. She looked around again, heart racing. Elara, it repeated, softer now, more like a breath than a word. I'm here, she whispered aloud, feeling foolish and strangely reverent. The air shimmered slightly. Not like heat waves, but like the edge of something almost visible. As though the boundary between her world and something deeper had thinned. And then it passed. Just as suddenly, the shimmer was gone, and the forest returned to stillness. But Elara knew something had changed. She had been noticed. Chosen, perhaps. Back at the lab, she reviewed the footage. The camera had captured the shimmer, a faint warping of light, like a ripple in space. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't imagining this. The forest was speaking. Not in sounds or symbols, but in frequencies, vibrations, and light. And she was beginning to understand. She scribbled the word across her notebook in capital letters. Connection. And beneath it. What does the forest remember, that we have forgotten? The memory of roots. Elara sat cross-legged in the center of the grove, her breath matching the slow rhythm of the forest. Around her, the trees stood. Like sentinels, ancient, rooted, wise. She placed her hand on the cool, damp earth once more, and this time, she didn't try to listen. She simply allowed herself to feel. Beneath the soil, where roots tangled like braids in the dark, something was moving, not physically, but energetically. There was a memory here. Not her own, not even human, but vivid and slow, like honey poured over stone. A memory not spoken in language but in cycles, rain and drought, bloom and decay, fire and regrowth. Elara had read about the Wood Wide Web, the vast fungal networks that let trees share nutrients and warnings. But this was beyond science. This felt like consciousness. She closed her eyes and let her thoughts drift. She saw a grove like this one, but in another time, untouched by roads or machines. A young tree pushing through the soil for the first time. A storm years later, its lightning scorching the bark but leaving the roots intact. The loss of nearby trees. The silence that followed. And then, new life. A seed sprouting in the ash. The forest remembered. She snapped awake, not because something startled her, but because something invited her. A sensation at the edge of perception tugged her attention to a narrow trail behind a curtain of vines. She hesitated. It hadn't been there before. Shouldering her pack, she stepped through. The path led down into a hollow where the air changed, warmer, thicker, almost humming. Bioluminescent fungi dotted the roots, glowing soft blue and violet. In the center, nestled between stones shaped by time and water, was a single tree unlike any she had ever seen. Its bark shimmered faintly, its leaves translucent and veined with silver-green threads. It radiated presence. Elara approached slowly, heart thudding. This was not a normal tree. This was a guardian. And in that moment, as she laid her palm on its bark, a rush of sensation surged through her, memories not her own but offered like gifts. A mountain collapsing in slow motion. Birds once common, now gone. The rise and fall of rivers. The laughter of children playing where now stood silence. Tears welled in her eyes. Not from sadness. From awe. The forest had witnessed everything. It had recorded it in rings, in leaves, in soil. And now it was opening its archives to her. A voice, as ancient as time and soft as wind, echoed in her mind once more. Learn us. Speak us. Remember with us. Elara understood now, her role wasn't to extract data from nature, but to listen. She was no longer a scientist studying the forest. She was a translator. And the code she had come to crack wasn't one of numbers and symbols. It was life itself. Patterns in the petals. The next morning arrived like a whisper. Mist curled low along the forest floor, and birds called out softly from high canopies, their melodies weaving into the hush of dawn. Elara awoke in her hammock, suspended gently between two ancient trees, their trunks wrapped in moss and morning dew. Though the sun was still shy behind the clouds, a golden hue touched the edges of everything. It felt like the forest was breathing with her, matching her slow rhythm. Elara rose and followed a stream she had noticed the day before. Its water moved lazily, glistening with reflected leaves and sky. Along the banks, wildflowers bloomed in riotous color, scarlet, indigo, ivory. But what struck her wasn't their beauty. It was their design. She crouched beside a cluster of violet asters, pulling her notebook from her pack. Each petal, five-fold symmetry. Each center, spiraling florets arranged in a perfect Fibonacci sequence. It wasn't random. Nature rarely is. There were numbers tucked into everything, spirals, branches, shells, seed pods. Patterns. Code hidden in plain sight, she whispered to herself. Seed arrangements. Bark textures. She labeled them in symbols, not words, drawing links between shapes and frequencies. It reminded her of music. Nature is a composer, she murmured. And I'm just beginning to hear the score. She stayed until twilight. When the sky turned rose and charcoal, and fireflies emerged from the undergrowth, Elara stood and looked back at the flowers once more. They weren't just blooming. They were speaking. And slowly, gently, she was beginning to understand. The language of leaves. Elara awoke to the sound of gentle rain tapping the canopy above her. It wasn't heavy, just a misty drizzle that turned the forest into a soft watercolor of greens and silvers. She stayed curled in her hammock for a while, listening to the quiet rhythm of droplets falling on leaves, like a lullaby whispered by the jungle itself. When she finally rose, she moved slowly, deliberately, as if the forest had taught her the art of stillness. Every movement was accompanied by the sound of nature, frogs croaking in the distance, insects humming near her boots, and the gentle swoosh of something unseen gliding through branches overhead. Today, she would study the leaves. She walked deeper into the forest, pausing often to observe. A tall kapok tree stood before her, its wide leaves fanning out like solar panels. Elara gently touched one and smiled. The veins were not random. They followed a fractal design, branching and rebranching in miniature versions of themselves. Self-similarity. She collected a few fallen leaves of different shapes and laid them on a flat stone. Maple, ficus, fern, banana, and a perfectly intact monstera. As she studied their structures, something clicked. Leaves are nature's data collectors. They absorb sunlight, exchange gases, regulate moisture. But more than that, their shapes hold evolutionary secrets, how a species survives heat, wind, and predators. The edges, the curves, the angles, none of it was accidental. She took out her magnifying lens and traced the network of veins within one leaf. It looked like a city's blueprint. Roads branching out, smaller alleys feeding neighborhoods, and central hubs connecting the whole. A map of survival. Elara whispered, nature writes its story in every cell. The rain stopped. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy, turning droplets on the leaves into tiny glowing orbs. The jungle shimmered. Then, a curious thing happened. A breeze stirred the leaves around her, not wildly, just enough. But the rustling wasn't chaotic. It had rhythm. A syncopated fluttering, like a coded message. Could wind translate the leaves' geometry into song? She reached for her audio recorder and pressed play. For a few minutes, she stood still, capturing the sound of rustling leaves. Listening. Later, she would compare their patterns, leaf vein density, blade shape, edge type, with the sounds they made. She suspected a correlation. She always did. As she worked, a butterfly landed on her notebook. Its wings opened slowly, revealing symmetrical eye spots and a hidden, vibrant blue. She looked closer and noticed that even its wing veins mirrored the same fractal logic. Leaves. Wings. Rivers. Lungs. The code repeated. Everything, it seemed, was a variation on a theme, a melody of survival, harmony, and resilience. As night fell and fireflies reappeared, Elara smiled, wrapping herself in her blanket and lying back beneath the stars. She whispered, "Tomorrow, I'll listen to the roots." And with that thought, she drifted into a dream woven of green patterns, ancient songs, and the soft, rustling language of leaves. Messages in the roots. Elara had always believed that the most profound stories were told in whispers, not with sound, but with signals. This morning, she found herself kneeling gently beside the base of a towering ceiba tree, its thick roots snaking like ancient veins into the earth. Her fingertips brushed the soil, still damp from last night's rain, and she closed her eyes, imagining what lay beneath. What most couldn't see, couldn't hear, was the secret network, the invisible language of the forest, the wood wide web. She pulled out a slim sensor from her field bag and carefully inserted it into the soil near the roots. The monitor blinked to life, showing the faint electrical pulses and subtle chemical changes between the fungi and the tree. It was astonishing, silent communication, yet relentless, flowing, alive. This was no ordinary root system. This was a social network, an underground symphony of messages exchanged between trees, fungi, bacteria, and tiny soil dwellers. The mycorrhizal fungi, Elara recalled, acted like telephone lines, connecting one tree to another, allowing them to share nutrients, warn of drought, or even send distress signals when pests attacked. She remembered something her mentor once said. Plants don't shout. They feel. They respond. Today, she was determined to listen. Hours passed as she mapped the fungal activity between trees. She discovered that the younger saplings clustered near the older ones received more shared sugars. The elders were feeding the youth. She smiled. This forest had elders, mentors, wisdom passed not in words, but in carbon and care. Near dusk, as the light dipped golden through the canopy, Elara poured warm tea into her travel mug and leaned back against the ceiba's thick trunk. Its bark was rough, but comforting, like an old friend's hand on your back. Suddenly, a small rustle beside her. A tapir, calm and curious, ambled slowly across the roots. It paused, sniffed the soil, and then moved on. Elara remained still, letting the moment pass without intrusion. The jungle was full of guests, and she was just one among them. As night descended, the sounds of the forest deepened, low croaks, soft wing flutters, leaves breathing in the cool air. Her equipment logged one final pulse from the roots beneath her, and she noted the timestamp. The roots sent signals most often at dawn and dusk. Like the tides, perhaps. Or dreams. She whispered into her recorder, "It's like the forest has a heart, and this is where it beats." Lying in her hammock that night, she drifted off wondering, if trees could feel connection beneath the ground, what else were they aware of? Were they conscious of time? Of each other's presence? Of her? The jungle hummed softly around her, and in the depths below, the roots continued their quiet, secret dialogue. And Elara slept, wrapped in the comfort of nature's deepest code. The language of leaves. The dawn light filtered through a curtain of mist as Elara sat on a moss-covered log, her notebook open and her gaze lifted to the emerald canopy above. The air was cool and damp, laced with the subtle perfume of wet leaves, orchid blossoms, and distant rain. Every leaf, she thought, was like a page in a language we hadn't fully learned to read, yet it spoke. Today, she would study the leaves. As a gentle breeze rustled the treetops, she noticed how certain trees moved before others. The palms flexed first, their long fronds swaying in rhythm, followed by the ficus, then the clustered shrubs. There was no chaos in the motion, it was orchestrated, like breath. Inhale. Pause. Exhale. Elara clipped a few fallen leaves into transparent frames and held them up to the light. Under her portable microscope, she examined the tiny pores, stomata, that opened and closed to let in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. These micro-openings pulsed gently as if the leaves were breathing. She scribbled, "Each leaf exhales what another inhales." A system of sharing. A dialogue of gases. Later, she set up her spectrometer to measure how different wavelengths of light reflected off the canopy. Red and blue were absorbed, green bounced back. That's why the forest shimmered in emerald. But the shimmer was more than color, it was information. She knew now that leaves changed their hues to warn others of danger, pests, or drought. They signaled their stress not with cries, but with color shifts. Plants didn't scream. They glowed. By mid-afternoon, the air had grown heavy. Rain began to patter down in soft, rhythmic taps on the leaves. Elara found shelter beneath a broad ceiba limb and watched droplets gather on the tips of leaves, slowly pooling until they fell in elegant arcs to the forest floor. It was like nature's metronome, measuring time with water. As she recorded her observations, a sudden flutter caught her attention. A morpho butterfly, its iridescent blue wings glinting in the low light, landed briefly on her shoulder. Elara stilled. The butterfly flapped once, then twice, before lifting back into the green cathedral of the canopy. She smiled. She felt part of something, something woven. Later, over a quiet dinner of rice and beans near her field tent, she reflected on a theory. What if leaves weren't just passive collectors of sunlight, but active listeners to their environment? What if they remembered? She wrote a single sentence in her journal. Perhaps the forest is made not of trees, but of messages. That night, wrapped in her blanket beneath a net of stars and vines, Elara dreamed of green language and leafy alphabets, of wind-carried sentences written in chlorophyll. And the forest, as always, whispered back. The secret network beneath our feet. The morning mist curled around the trunks like ancient incense, rising from the rainforest floor in a soft hush. Elara crouched close to the soil, her fingers brushing gently over the surface of decaying leaves and damp earth. Today, her curiosity led her beneath the surface, into the unseen realm where roots whispered, and fungi carried secrets. She unfolded a fine mesh square and laid it on the ground, then took a sample of soil with a small spade. Carefully, she placed it in a petri dish and returned to her temporary research hut tucked under a flowering fig tree. There, her microscope hummed quietly, waiting. What she was searching for was not a living creature in the traditional sense, but a network. A mycorrhizal web. Through the lens, Elara saw it, thin, thread-like filaments, hyphae, spreading like gossamer across the soil particles. They looked like tiny roots, but they weren't plant. They were fungi, ancient, silent messengers. They connected trees to each other underground, forming a forest internet, a communication highway hidden beneath their feet. She had read about it in journals. When one tree is under attack from beetles or drought, it sends distress signals through these fungal threads. Neighboring trees receive the warning and activate their defenses, long before danger arrives. It was cooperation, not competition. Solidarity, not solitude. Elara to herself, she murmured, the trees are talking. She placed sensors on a few tree roots and ran a mild electrical current to track signal speed and direction. When she exposed one sapling to simulated stress, removing a small amount of water from its roots, within hours, a nearby sapling had begun conserving its own moisture. No contact. Just information shared underground. She was mesmerized. Not only could plants send chemical warnings through the air, but they could speak beneath the ground, in a code humans had only begun to decipher. Sitting by the base of a giant kapok tree, she closed her eyes and imagined the forest not as individual organisms, but as one great, breathing, sensing being, connected by whispers in the soil. As the sun broke through the canopy in soft shafts, she made a note in her journal. This is not a forest. It's a family. That evening, the air was filled with the scent of damp bark and blooming bromeliads. Elara sipped tea brewed from guava leaves and listened to the distant call of a howler monkey, as if even the animals were tuned into the forest's secret language. That night, she dreamed of glowing threads wrapping around roots, of knowledge passed silently between trees, and of a world where cooperation reigned quietly beneath every step. The network never slept. And for the first time, Elara realized, neither did the forest. The tree that remembered. A few days after her discovery of the underground network, Elara found herself drawn to a tree unlike any other in the rainforest. It stood quietly at the edge of a clearing, older than the others, its bark deeply furrowed like the pages of an ancient book. Thick vines curled around its base, and orchids bloomed along its limbs like little lanterns. Locals called it Abuelo Verde, the green grandfather. Legends claimed it was one of the oldest living beings in that part of the rainforest, and that strange things happened beneath its branches. Some swore the tree could remember faces, and that it would drop a blossom, or a fruit, only for those it recognized. Of course, Elara knew trees didn't think like humans. But after everything she'd seen with the fungal networks, the water sharing, and the chemical warnings, the line between folklore and science no longer seemed so rigid. That day, she returned to Abuelo Verde with a thermos of tea and her notebook. She sat beneath the canopy and placed a small recorder at the tree's roots, not to hear sound, but to detect the subsonic vibrations plants sometimes emit. While the forest buzzed gently with cicadas, her mind drifted. Could a tree remember? Recent studies in plant neurobiology hinted that some species could learn from experience. Pea plants had shown anticipation. Mimosa pudica, the shy plant, learned not to close its leaves after repeated harmless touches. Could this ancient tree, rooted in generations of forest memory, possess something like long-term awareness? She reached up and gently touched the bark. It was warm, pulsing faintly beneath her fingers, the way a stone holds the sun. "What have you seen?" she whispered. Elara decided to run a light electrical stimulus test, not harmful, just enough to observe response patterns in the tree's vascular system. She noted the way the tree responded faster after repeated inputs. Subtle changes. Almost like expectation. She sat back in awe. The data wasn't proof, but it was a beginning. As dusk crept over the forest, Abuelo Verde released a slow, fragrant breath of air. A single blossom fell, landing on the page of her journal. It was pale gold and sweet-scented, shaped like a star. She smiled. The tree had never dropped a flower before. That night, wrapped in her hammock under the stars, Elara imagined a tree that remembered the rain patterns of centuries past. A tree that responded to the footsteps of a familiar researcher. A tree that learned not in the way we understand, but in the way nature always had, slowly, patiently, quietly. The rainforest wasn't just alive. It was aware. And in that awareness, it held more wisdom than any library on earth. The language of leaves. The morning light filtered through a soft mist as Elara stepped out of her tent. With her notebook pressed to her chest. The rainforest, after a night of delicate rain, gleamed with dew, and the air shimmered with a serenity only the forest could provide. The world here always seemed as if it were on the edge of waking and dreaming. Today, her focus turned to something often overlooked: the leaves. Leaves were everywhere. They reached, stretched, fluttered, curled, and sometimes even blushed. But to Alara, they were more than green shapes. They were communication platforms, messengers carrying chemical signals across the canopy and through the understory. She had read about how some plants, when bitten by insects, released volatile organic compounds, chemical messages, to warn their neighbors. Those neighboring plants would then begin to boost their own defenses, as if bracing for war. But what fascinated Alara wasn't the warning, it was the choice. Why did some trees speak louder than others? Why did some wait? She selected a cluster of heliconia leaves and began to mist them gently with a synthetic mimic of insect saliva, which she had carefully prepared in her portable lab. Within minutes, neighboring plants started to show signs of defensive changes. Microscopic pores on their leaves began to shrink. Others shifted the angle of their leaves ever so slightly to reduce exposure. It was a conversation in slow motion. Alara recorded every subtle change. The plants weren't just reacting. They were interacting, making decisions, forming networks, responding to more than just stimulus. They were living narratives, shaped by wind, water, sun, and each other. She remembered the words of a botanist she once studied. Plants are not silent. We're simply not listening slowly enough. In her quiet excitement, Alara placed her palm against a large monstera leaf and whispered, "I see you now." The leaf trembled, not from wind, but perhaps from the acknowledgement. As the day faded into twilight, the forest leaves shimmered in the golden hour light. And though Alara was surrounded by stillness, she knew it wasn't silence. It was dialogue. Ancient. Ongoing. Profound. That night, as she lay beneath the shelter of emerald shadows and whispering fronds, the soft rustle of leaves became a lullaby. One filled with questions, connections, and codes. And in that melodic rustling, she realized. Nature speaks in leaves. We only need to learn the dialect. The dreaming roots. As dawn stirred the rainforest awake, Alara sat cross-legged near the base of a towering kapok tree. Its massive trunk stretched skyward like a cathedral pillar, but her attention was drawn not to its height, but to its roots, those ancient arms reaching into the dark, unseen world beneath. She had come to understand that roots were far more than anchors. They were thinkers. Feelers. Connectors. In this hidden web, a secret symphony pulsed with signals, carried not by light or wind, but through the soil itself. Here, among the knotted tangle of root networks, Alara focused on a question that had followed her for weeks. Do plants dream? Of course, not dreams like ours. But perhaps a form of night rhythm, a slow, internal shifting. She had read about circadian cycles in flora, how even without sunlight, plants moved in 24-hour patterns, pulsing like a heartbeat. It wasn't just about survival. It was about timing. About sensing. She gently placed sensors along the root system of a fig tree and another on a fern nearby. As dusk had fallen the night before, their chemical outputs began to shift, lowering certain metabolic functions, increasing others. The changes weren't random. They were coordinated. As if the forest, beneath the surface, was synchronizing into a nightly hush. But there was more. A day earlier, Alara had given one sapling a rich nutrient solution. Overnight, she observed the surrounding roots sharing that nourishment, moving water and minerals through fungal filaments like a social network. This wasn't just response. It was altruism. Some called this the Wood Wide Web, an underground internet of mycorrhizal fungi linking trees, allowing them to trade resources and information. But Alara didn't think of it as a network. She thought of it as a dream the forest shared, every night, in whispers beneath the soil. As the afternoon sun warmed the mossy floor, Alara closed her eyes and placed her hand on the earth. She imagined the roots speaking in vibrations, pulses, chemical poems only the soil could carry. Each tree, each fern, each delicate sprout adding to a symphony unheard, but very much alive. The ground beneath her didn't feel still anymore. It felt like a lullaby in slow motion. That night, as she drifted to sleep beneath the canopy, she imagined dreams traveling through roots, woven in the dark, tangled in the deep, and felt the comfort of being part of a system far older and wiser than herself. Beneath the surface, the forest dreams. And she was finally listening. The forest that remembers. The forest had begun to feel more like a companion than a place. Ilara wandered deeper along a leaf-dappled path, where the trees grew thicker and their trunks bore the marks of time, moss-covered grooves, twisted bark, and scars from storms long past. She had learned that forests were not just collections of trees, they were living archives, holding memories written not in ink, but in rings, spores, and seeds. She paused beside an old cedar, its base wide enough to hold a small library. She placed her hand gently against the bark. Inside, concentric rings told stories she could never hear but could almost feel. Years of drought, seasons of abundance, moments of stress, all encoded in the wood itself. Trees remembered in silence. But the deeper magic was found in how they shared those memories. Through the forest's underground fungal networks, Ilara had discovered that older trees communicated with the younger ones. When a new sapling sprouted in shade, the elders didn't compete, they fed it. Sugars moved beneath the ground, transferred to help the next generation grow. Even more astonishing, if a pest attacked one tree, nearby trees responded, releasing protective chemicals before being touched. It was as if the forest warned itself. That evening, Ilara sat with her notebook, gazing at the soft, golden light falling through the canopy. She thought about the long-dead trees whose nutrients now lived on in new trunks. About the forest's quiet adaptability, its lessons passed in pollen and wind. What if the forest didn't just remember for itself? What if it remembered for us? Centuries of growth, of resilience, of sacrifice. Lessons in balance. In patience. In collaboration. She wrote in the margin of her notebook. Memory without words. A library of breath and root. Ilara leaned against the cedar, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. The air was cool. A breeze carried the scent of wet bark and fern. And as she drifted into a slow, dreamy rest, she imagined the forest whispering its memories, across time, across species, across silence. The forest never forgets. And tonight, she was part of its memory. Seeds of tomorrow. As dawn painted the treetops in gold and rose, Ilara awoke to the faint rustle of leaves, gentle, like a lullaby being replayed in reverse. The air was heavy with dew, and around her, the forest breathed in silence. Today, her path led her into a sunlit clearing surrounded by tall, whispering grasses and wildflowers. But what caught her attention wasn't the blooms, it was the ground itself. Scattered across the soil were tiny, intricate seeds, each one unique, like miniature scrolls sealed with genetic secrets. She knelt and picked one up, a maple seed, papery and curled like a little wing. Another was a chestnut, smooth and firm. Each seed, though small, held vast potential. But it was more than just potential, it was memory, a tiny code, patiently waiting to be unlocked by warmth, rain, and time. Ilara marveled at how a seed somehow knew how tall a tree should grow, how wide its branches should stretch, how deep its roots should reach. Yet the code wasn't rigid. It could adapt. A tree grown in wind became stronger. A tree grown in shade leaned toward light. Nature, she realized, encoded not only form, but resilience. And some seeds? Some remained dormant for decades, waiting for the perfect moment to emerge. After fire. After flood. After a long, silent wait. How wise, Ilara thought, that life knew when to pause, and when to begin again. She opened her journal, sketching the different shapes and spirals of the seeds. Around her, insects hummed, a woodpecker knocked in the distance, and a soft breeze danced through the leaves. In every seed, she wrote, is a story not yet told. A quiet promise to the future. A code that unfolds only when the world is ready. And then she thought, perhaps humans had such seeds inside them too. Ideas. Dreams. Hopes. Waiting for the right moment to grow. As the sun climbed higher, she stood, brushing soil from her hands, and smiled. Because the forest had reminded her of something simple and powerful. You don't need to rush to bloom. Even the greatest trees begin as silent, sleeping seeds. The forest's secret symphony. Elara stepped softly beneath the emerald canopy, where the late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves in golden ribbons. Every step she took brought a slight crunch beneath her boots, twigs, fallen leaves, old bark, all playing their gentle notes in the quiet orchestra of the forest floor. But today, she wasn't focused on what she could see. She closed her eyes, and listened. The forest had a song. Not one made of melodies or rhythms as humans know them, but one composed of life in constant motion. The faint buzz of bees among high blossoms, the soft flutter of bird wings, the drip of water from a distant stream. And underneath it all, the inaudible pulse of something even older, communication. Trees, she had learned, don't speak in words, but they do speak. Through roots, fungi, and chemical signals, they send messages underground, from one to another. Elara knelt beside a moss-covered stump and gently brushed aside the topsoil to reveal the fine, silvery threads of mycorrhizal fungi. These threads, microscopic and almost invisible, connected tree to tree like the wires of an ancient telegraph system. A birch tree in distress could send a warning. A mother tree could share nutrients with her saplings. And trees of different species, once thought to compete, often shared resources with one another when the forest needed balance. It was breathtaking. A world beneath the world. The forest, she realized, was a symphony not of sound, but of connection. Every tree had its note, every fungi its chord, every animal its melody. Together, they formed something beautiful and whole, something no single part could create alone. She sat down, leaning against the base of a great cedar tree, and breathed slowly. In every silence, she whispered to herself, there's a song waiting to be heard. Birdsong trickled through the leaves above. A breeze passed, making the treetops sway in unison, like dancers in a slow and ancient waltz. And in that moment, Elara wasn't just a visitor. She was a note in the song. A breath in the wind. A pause between heartbeats in the great forest symphony. The hidden mathematics of petals and pine cones. Elara stood in a quiet meadow that bloomed in soft pastel hues, lavender, cream, butter yellow, and the delicate blush of spring roses. The air smelled faintly of honeysuckle, and somewhere nearby, a brook murmured its lazy song. Yet her eyes weren't on the colors or the scent, they were fixed on patterns. She gently turned a daisy in her fingers, counting the number of petals. 21. She picked up a pine cone and traced the spiral arrangement of its scales. 13 left-turning spirals, 8 turning right. There it was again. That number sequence she kept encountering, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. Fibonacci. Nature didn't just grow. It calculated. Hidden within the shapes of flowers and the branching of trees was a mathematical language more ancient than any human text. Every leaf, every petal, every shell held a whisper of this order. How did the sunflower know to form its seeds in spirals that aligned with Fibonacci numbers? Why did branches on a tree split in golden ratios? How did the universe embed such elegance in something as humble as a pine cone? She opened her notebook and sketched a spiral, overlaying it on the petals of a rose. It matched perfectly. This wasn't just coincidence, it was nature's code of efficiency and beauty. Spirals allowed for maximum sunlight absorption, minimal waste, and perfect packing. Mathematics wasn't cold or mechanical here, it was art, it was poetry. It was life itself. Elara lay down on the soft meadow grass, her head cradled by a mossy patch and her notebook resting on her chest. As clouds floated lazily overhead, she thought of galaxies spiraling far beyond sight, their shapes echoing the same golden spirals in the daisy she'd held moments ago. From the petals of a flower to the arms of the stars, the same design. The same rhythm. Even chaos, she murmured, eyes drifting closed, has its symmetry. A breeze passed gently through the grass, brushing her skin like a lullaby from the earth itself. In a world full of noise, numbers, and schedules, Elara had found something still, eternal, and quietly miraculous. She was beginning to see the code. And more than that, she was starting to understand it. The language of fractals. Elara wandered deeper into a quiet forest, older, denser, cloaked in moss and mist. The trees here seemed taller, their trunks gnarled by centuries, bark layered like memory. But what truly caught her eye weren't the towering redwoods or the lichens on stone. It was the repetition. She bent down beside a fern. Each frond was made of smaller fronds, which were in turn made of even tinier versions of the same shape. A pattern within a pattern, self-similarity that echoed into miniature worlds. Fractals. This was nature's recursive poetry, shapes that repeated at every scale, each mirroring the larger whole. The branching of trees, the structure of snowflakes, the web of rivers, even the jagged lines of coastlines, they all whispered this same geometric rhythm. Elara opened her sketchbook and drew the fern again. With each layer, she zoomed in. And still the pattern remained. She remembered the Mandelbrot set, a famous fractal shape that mathematicians had explored for years. And though it was created through equations, it looked like something pulled straight from the heart of a forest. Could it be that the math was not imitating nature, but revealing it? With each breath, she became more certain, the world wasn't made of separate things, but repeating stories. A tree echoed a river, a cloud mimicked a cauliflower, a lightning bolt branched. Like a vein. As dusk painted the forest in soft lilac shadows, Elara stood still, looking around with new eyes. Nothing was random. Every leaf's edge, every lightning fork, every root system followed an unseen blueprint. A code as ancient as the stars and as alive as the soil beneath her boots. Even her own lungs, she realized, branched like trees. Was she made from the forest, or was the forest a mirror of her? She lay on a bed of fallen leaves, the patterns cradling her into calm. Above her, bare branches etched their own fractal silhouettes into the deepening sky. And as sleep came gently, Elara dreamed not of isolated things, but of connections. Infinite, beautiful, endlessly repeating connections. Songs beneath the soil. Beneath the soft forest floor, Elara imagined the world beneath her feet, not empty or silent, but humming with quiet purpose. She crouched beside a rotting log, brushing away the leaf litter and inhaling the rich scent of earth. Here, in the dark unseen spaces of the soil, lay one of nature's most intricate codes, hidden not in light, but in shadow. Fungi. Tiny threads called mycelium wove beneath her boots like an underground web, connecting tree to tree, root to root. Scientists called it the wood wide web. Elara called it a forest's whispered language. Each filament, called a hypha, was thinner than a human hair but stretched for miles, transmitting nutrients, warnings, and even what seemed like messages. A tree under attack by insects could tell its neighbors. A mother tree could feed her saplings through this network. It wasn't just biology, it was collaboration. Elara remembered a study where dying trees gave their final sugars to younger ones through these fungal threads. Not because they had to, but because nature's hidden code often chose cooperation over competition. She lay her palm on the soil, wondering if she could feel it, the pulsing current of energy, of sharing, of survival through unity. The mycelium didn't just deliver food. It delivered memory. There was something poetic in it, a system that relied on giving, on trust between beings that couldn't speak aloud. A forest that thought, that remembered, that responded. And somehow, as she sat in stillness, Elara felt a response too. Not in words, but in warmth. The forest was alive, not just above, but below. Not just in what was visible, but in what waited patiently beneath. The silence of soil wasn't emptiness, it was a lullaby, humming low and eternal. As the day faded and stars emerged in silver stillness above the canopy, Elara whispered thanks to the roots and threads and gentle teachers beneath her. And when sleep finally claimed her, it was soft and mossy and deep, just like the forest's embrace. The intelligence of a leaf. Elara sat beneath a sprawling oak, her notebook open but untouched in her lap. A single golden leaf had fluttered down and come to rest on the page. She didn't move it. Instead, she stared at it, the veins threading outward from the stem like rivers across a landscape, the edges gently curled, the green giving way to amber. It was a thing so simple, and yet, when she truly looked, it held layers of complexity that rivaled any machine, any algorithm. A leaf, after all, was a laboratory. Inside it, sunlight became sugar through photosynthesis, a miracle that powered nearly all life. But it wasn't just light that guided a leaf's choices. Leaves sensed gravity, changed orientation based on wind, curled during droughts, released chemicals when chewed upon. In every way that mattered, a leaf was aware. And not just aware, it was responsive. Elara recalled a study where scientists observed that when one plant was injured, others nearby responded even before the attacker reached them. They weren't just passive green things. They were alert, cautious, communicative. They had memory, not like ours, but in electric signals and chemical pulses. She lifted the golden leaf and placed it gently in her notebook. "You're a scientist, too," she whispered. Above her, thousands of leaves whispered in the late afternoon breeze, each one a sensor, a processor, a little mind in the great network of the tree. Elara thought of all the times she had walked beneath trees without truly seeing them. All the days she'd sat in gardens and never once wondered what the plants might be feeling. She felt small, but not in a lonely way. In the way that came from being a part of something vast, something wise. When night came and stars blinked overhead, Elara stayed where she was, resting her head against the trunk of the oak. She breathed with the forest. And the forest, in its leafy stillness, breathed with her. In the hush between those breaths, she found something she didn't know she'd been looking for, peace. And the leaf, pressed gently between the notebook pages, carried that memory into dreams. The underground symphony. In the quiet hush of evening, Elara stepped off the worn forest path and knelt by the roots of an ancient beech tree. Her hands brushed the soft moss, fingers trailing along the bark that had felt centuries pass. But what intrigued her now lay beneath the soil, hidden, humming, alive. The ground, she had learned, was not just earth and roots. It was a bustling world of threads and whispers, of fungi and memory, of trees speaking in silence. The mycorrhizal network. A word as strange as the web it described. Beneath Elara's feet, an invisible fungal network stretched out for miles, connecting trees to one another like neural threads in a brain. Each tiny strand of mycelium wrapped around roots and into them, exchanging nutrients and messages like a telephone line made of lace and light. It was sometimes called the Wood Wide Web. She thought of it as a secret symphony. Through this underground network, mother trees fed their young, sick trees received nutrients, and dying trees gave away their last reserves to others. A forest wasn't a collection of trees, it was one being, many minds, one breath. Elara placed a small sensor into the ground, linked to her portable monitor. The data began to hum, lines of signals rising and falling like music. Spikes showed pulses of sugar, surges of nitrogen, even chemical warnings sent from a tree attacked by beetles miles away. They were talking, right now. Are you listening to each other? She whispered aloud, smiling. Or are you listening to me? She imagined them as elders gathered in silent conversation, trading stories in sap and spores, gently reminding one another, we are not alone. We are not separate. Beneath the surface, the forest was alive in ways that defied imagination. As dusk fell, Elara lay back on a mossy patch, the beech tree behind her like a sentinel. She closed her eyes and let her thoughts melt into the earth, into the songs beneath her, into the millions of filaments brushing root to root, heart to heart. And for the first time in many restless nights, she drifted into sleep without a single thought, only the steady, silent rhythm of the forest, singing her softly home. Crystals that remember. Night had deepened over the forest as Elara sat beside a shallow stream, its water gliding over polished stones like whispered lullabies. The moonlight traced silver lines along the surface, dancing with each ripple. But Elara's gaze was not on the water, it was on the crystals resting in her palm. She turned the smooth, quartz-like shard gently, catching glimpses of rainbow flecks hidden within its core. It wasn't just a pretty mineral, it was a keeper of time. A recorder of Earth's most ancient secrets. In her research, Elara had come across the idea that crystals could remember the environments in which they formed. Every pressure, every temperature, every mineral solution left behind a trace, tiny structures locked inside that acted like a journal. Like tree rings marking seasons, or ice cores preserving ancient air, these crystals were nature's quiet scribes. Elara placed one under her field microscope and looked closer. As she adjusted the lens, she imagined what the crystal might whisper if it could speak. I formed in darkness, it might say. Beneath the crust, over eons, while the continents shifted above me. I have felt the heat of the mantle and the pressure of ancient oceans. I have been buried, broken, reborn. She ran her fingertip along its edge and felt a kind of reverence. There were crystals, such as zircons, that dated back more than 4 billion years. Older than any mountain. Older than any sea. These tiny minerals carried microscopic pockets of ancient water, long-vanished atmospheres, or even tiny fragments of carbon that may have come from the stars. To Elara, they weren't just rocks. They were messages from deep time, time capsules of creation. She thought of all the invisible codes locked within them, of a planet writing its story in the language of atoms. As she leaned back against a boulder, the crystal resting beside her, the stream continued its endless journey, whispering to the stones, carrying with it stories to be told by the patient scribes of the earth. Sleep came to her gently, as if the forest and the crystal together had lulled her into a deeper understanding, that the world was full of memory, even in the silence. The secret signals of leaves. Elara woke to the soft hush of morning mist curling through the forest canopy. The light was dappled, painted in shades of green and gold. Birds chirped quietly overhead, but Elara's attention was drawn to something else, something subtler, yet profoundly alive. She ran her fingers along the surface of a broad, waxy leaf. It shimmered faintly with dew, but her mind was on what lay beneath that surface, what the leaf was saying. To most, a leaf is a simple thing, a collector of sunlight, a maker of food. But Elara knew better. She had discovered that leaves are chatterboxes in their own right, sending constant signals, not only within the plant, but to the world around them. Using hidden chemical codes, a leaf can whisper warnings, call for help, or even manipulate the behavior of animals and insects. When a caterpillar begins chewing on a leaf, the plant releases volatile organic compounds, aromatic messages carried on the wind. These messages can travel to nearby plants, warning them to prepare their defenses. Even more impressively, some of these messages attract predators of the leaf-eating pests. A sort of natural call to arms. As Elara studied a cluster of trembling leaves, she imagined their quiet conversation. She's here, one might say. The light is strong today, another replied. I've been bitten, a third might murmur, releasing a fragrant signal of distress. With a portable gas chromatograph at her side, Elara collected tiny samples of the air around different leaves. She traced the faint perfume of methyl jasmonate and salicylic acid, two molecules in the symphony of plant defense. But this wasn't just about battle cries. Leaves also sent messages of peace, signals to grow, to bloom, to form alliances with fungi in the soil. Elara closed her eyes and imagined a world where we could hear these signals in real time. A rustling forest might suddenly feel like a crowded city, each plant busy exchanging quiet updates in its own green language. As the mist lifted and the first bee of the morning bumbled past her, she smiled. There was a story in every leaf, a language not written in letters but in scent and structure, rhythm and chemistry. And as the forest awakened around her, Elara felt deeply connected to it all. The trees, the leaves, the invisible code of nature, an unending dialogue that she was just beginning to understand. She leaned back on the mossy ground, letting the sounds and scents of the forest carry her into a peaceful daydream, knowing that even in stillness, nature never stopped speaking. The code beneath the forest floor. Elara crouched low to the ground, brushing aside a layer of fallen leaves to expose the rich, dark soil beneath. It was damp and crumbly, filled with tiny roots weaving through like threads in a vast underground tapestry. But what fascinated her most was something she couldn't see, something older than civilization, and perhaps just as complex. The Wood Wide Web. It sounded like something out of science fiction, but it was as real as the trees towering above her. A vast, living network of fungal threads, mycorrhizae, linking trees and plants in a communication and support system more intricate than anything humans had yet built. Beneath the forest floor, these fungal filaments connected the roots of different species, allowing them to share resources, nutrients, water, and even chemical signals. A mother tree could nurture her saplings. An injured tree could receive aid from its neighbors. Even dying trees could pass on their remaining energy to the next generation. Elara had long suspected that this hidden network might be the brain of the forest, not a central processor, but a cooperative intelligence, distributed and selfless. She'd once likened it to a neural net, not made of neurons but of roots and filaments, each pulse a silent thought. She placed a small probe gently into the soil, designed to detect and translate subtle chemical changes and electrical impulses. As the data streamed into her tablet, a pattern began to emerge, slow, rhythmic pulses. A conversation, perhaps. Not in words, but in waves of nutrients and signals. A language older than mammals, spoken in pulses and molecules. She remembered a study in which trees had been shown to warn each other of drought, sharing water and slowing growth across the entire community. The network, it seemed, could even act in anticipation. Sitting in the quiet, Elara felt the hum of it. The stillness of the surface belied the furious coordination happening below. Tiny fungi, only micrometers wide, were reaching, sensing, communicating. Nature's hidden code was not just in DNA but in this ancient alliance between plants and fungi. Above her, a breeze stirred the leaves. Below, the forest's secrets traveled unseen, slow, steady, and wise. It made her feel small, but not in a way that frightened her. It was humbling. Comforting. She looked up at the trees and whispered, "Thank you." Then, lying back against a cushion of moss, Elara let herself drift into a nap, her dreams tangled gently in the filaments of the earth, where wisdom flows silently in a network of trust and time. The seeds of memory. Elara stood quietly in a clearing at the edge of the forest, her boots barely disturbing the mossy ground beneath her. Before her, an ancient oak tree loomed, its broad branches stretching outward like arms cradling the sky. The bark was gnarled and etched with time. This tree had lived through centuries of storms, seasons, and stories. And beneath it, something extraordinary was unfolding. She had returned to study the memory of seeds, a phrase that had haunted her since reading a rare paper buried in the archives of botanical science. Could a seed remember the life of its parent tree? Could the experiences of one generation be passed quietly into the next, tucked inside the spiral of DNA or whispered through epigenetic signals. As she knelt near the roots, she uncovered a small cluster of acorns. Each one, though tiny, carried inside it the potential to become a towering tree, shaped not only by sunlight and soil, but also by legacy. In the lab, she'd seen clues, subtle gene expressions in seedlings that reflected droughts, fires, and stresses endured by their parent trees. It was as if nature had written a diary, passed down through tiny biochemical notes, so that the next generation might grow wiser, stronger, better prepared. Elara held an acorn in her hand. It was warm from the sun, smooth and solid. "You've seen more than we'll ever understand," she whispered to it. "And yet you remain silent." But were they truly silent? A growing body of research suggested that plants could retain biochemical traces of the past, responses shaped not only by their immediate environment but also by what their ancestors had survived. This memory wasn't like human recollection. It wasn't a conscious remembrance, but something more primal. It was adaptive memory, etched into the very instructions for life. Beneath the soil, in that fertile dark where fungi and roots whispered to one another, those acorns would someday sprout, carrying with them more than just genes. They carried a forest's resilience. As twilight fell, the golden light filtered through the branches like a hush. Birds settled in for the night. The air grew cool and still. Elara laid back on a bed of fallen leaves, staring upward as stars blinked into view. She imagined all the seeds across the world, each one a capsule of quiet wisdom, holding stories older than humanity. They waited, patient, poised, for the right time to wake and grow. And as her eyes fluttered shut, Elara smiled at the thought that memory in nature wasn't kept in books or minds. It was carried in roots, in seeds, in silence, and in the code of life itself. The code continues. The rain came softly. Elara stood beneath the canopy of an old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest, her raincoat speckled with droplets, her breath visible in the cool morning air. Mist curled through the trees like ancient spirits rising from slumber, and the forest hummed with life. She had walked for hours through trails thick with ferns and moss, following no map, just instinct. This was her last journey for the project. She paused at the base of a towering redwood, taller than any cathedral, older than many civilizations. Her hand rested on its bark, deeply furrowed, scented with sap and history. She could almost feel the quiet pulse of life coursing upward through the xylem, like a living elevator of memory and nourishment. This wasn't just a tree, it was a testament. After all her explorations, bioluminescent fungi, migratory instincts, mycelial networks, plant memory, genetic codes, Elara had come to understand something deeper. Nature was not just a collection of organisms. It was a story. One written not in ink, but in molecules, signals, seasons, and silence. She opened her journal and wrote the final line. The code was never hidden. We were just too loud to hear it. A robin chirped. A squirrel darted by, its fur puffed against the chill. Far above, branches danced in the wind, whispering to one another in creaks and rustles. And below, the roots remained silent, as always, keeping time. Elara smiled softly. Her mission had begun as a search for understanding, but it had become something more spiritual, a rediscovery of humility. Humanity had always thought it stood above nature, apart from it. But here, under the boughs of trees older than memory, she felt woven into the fabric of everything. She took a long breath of pine-scented air, letting it fill her lungs. Around her, life unfolded with no urgency, no rush, just purpose. Ferns unfurled. Mushrooms blossomed in shadow. Water flowed through roots and stones. Everything moved as it always had, patiently, wisely, with quiet intelligence. As dusk descended, Elara lay on a patch of soft moss, her backpack under her head, listening to the forest's lullaby. Somewhere nearby, an owl hooted. Somewhere far away, stars began to pierce the sky. And as her eyes closed, the final thought she carried was this: we are not separate from nature's code. We are written into it. The final signal. The lab was silent, not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that holds meaning. A faint hum lingered in the air, like a forgotten melody whispering through machines. Eliana sat quietly in front of her monitors, eyes half closed. Her heartbeat wasn't racing, but it felt deep, like it was waiting for something sacred. Suddenly, one of the screens glowed softly. A signal appeared, not just any code. It read: sequence complete. You are now one with the pattern. Eliana leaned forward, breath caught. These weren't numbers or formulas. These were symbols, the same sacred symbols she had seen in the jungle, etched into trees, floating in her dreams, dancing in starlight. But now, they were alive. Each symbol moved and morphed gently, almost breathing. And as she reached out instinctively, her fingers began to trace the patterns, not consciously, but in perfect sync. Her body wasn't acting on logic, it was responding to something deeper. Something natural. Her breath slowed. She could feel it, not just see it. The air held a different frequency now, like the earth had exhaled just for her. Another message appeared on the screen. One word only. Listen. And she did. She listened to the hum of the machines, no longer mechanical, but musical. The blinking lights were no longer warnings, they were rhythms. Even the wind outside tapped gently against the glass like a whisper from the universe. Everything pulsed with one silent truth. You have become what you were born to be. Tears slipped down Eliana's cheek, not of pain, not of confusion, but of understanding. For the first time, her science wasn't work. It was harmony. She reached for the keyboard and pressed save. Not because she needed to record the data, but because she wanted to honor the moment. She knew no one else would ever decode this the way she did. Because this knowledge wasn't written for the mind. It was written for the soul. And in that moment, the signal slowly transformed into a soft lullaby, one only she could hear. The lab didn't feel like a lab anymore. It felt like home. And in that silence, Eliana didn't discover something new. She became something new. Rest in rhythm. Eliana slowly rose from her lab chair. No urgency. No tension. For the first time in years, there was no need to run. Just the need to feel. She sat down on the floor, carefully, intentionally, as though the earth itself was calling her to be still. She closed her eyes. Inhale, exhale. Each breath felt like a heartbeat. And each heartbeat matched something beyond her, the gentle rhythm of the living universe. She could feel it all. The quiet sway of the tree branches outside. The hum of the air conditioner blending with the faint tapping of raindrops. Even the walls, they weren't still. They vibrated, like they were breathing with her. Her senses didn't sharpen, they softened. She was no longer trying to understand the world. She was simply becoming part of it. Her monitors glowed dimly. No data streamed anymore. Just soft, gentle waves. Sleep frequencies. Melodies of stillness. Her research, years of it, was now a lullaby, not a lab report. She laid down on the cold floor. And it didn't feel cold. It felt like peace. No pillow, no blanket, but she felt wrapped in something invisible. Warmth from within. She smiled. And for the first time, the smile wasn't for results or discoveries. It was for herself. In the quiet, she saw the tree again, the one from her dreams. This time, it didn't speak. It simply smiled back. Like it was proud of her. And slowly, everything faded into a soft, dark quiet. But the darkness didn't scare her. It felt like a soft night sky tucking her in. That night, Eliana didn't just learn to sleep. She learned to sleep with the universe. Heartbeat. Breath. Stars. All in rhythm. And that rhythm had a name. Peace. The sleep code. Eliana was drifting, but this wasn't ordinary sleep. It wasn't the kind that shuts down the body. This was a descent into something ancient. Something sacred. In her sleep, she found herself standing at the edge of a crystal-clear lake. The water was still, so perfectly still, it didn't just reflect her face. It reflected her soul. Beside the lake stood a stone tablet. Etched on it were the same strange symbols she had seen in her dreams, in the forest, in the shifting starlight. But now, they were changing. Each symbol began to glow softly and transform. One turned into the feeling of peace. Another, the warmth of a mother's embrace. A third, the quiet silence of forgotten books. She understood now. This was the sleep code. A language not written for the brain, but for the heart. Eliana reached out and dipped her hand into the water. Gentle ripples spread, and in those ripples danced emotions. Her memories, her hopes, her deepest longings, all alive, all seen. Then she heard a voice, not male, not female, just presence. Soft, calm, infinite. You've spent your life awake for the world, now, for the first time, you're asleep for yourself. And when someone sleeps for the soul, not just the body, they become the purest part of the universe. At that moment, Eliana understood. All her research, all her coding, her discoveries, they weren't about data. They were about this. A sleep so deep, so true, it restores your entire being. Her body slowly began to dissolve, not into death, but into elements. Into air, into stardust, into light. There was no pain, no fear, only a soft surrender. A single tear formed in her eye. And with it, she took her final conscious breath. And became one with the sleep code. Eternal silence. Everything had stopped. The lab still glowed gently, but not with urgency. It was a calm light, like the final flicker of a candle that knows it fulfilled its purpose. Eliana's chair sat empty. The monitors were still on, but they no longer blinked with data. The machines hummed softly, not as alarms, but as goodbyes. They weren't running. They were remembering. A quiet wind moved through the room, slow and warm. It brushed past the scattered papers on her desk. And as the pages fluttered gently, they didn't feel like documents. They felt like part of a farewell symphony. Her journal lay open. One final word written in her hand. Peace. And then, a soft glow appeared in the center of the room. Not bright, not harsh. Just presence. Like the universe had come to sit beside her. Eliana was nowhere to be seen. And yet, she was everywhere. She was in the air. In the molecules. In the quiet rhythm between atoms. She had become not part of the code. But the code itself. No end. No beginning. Just silence. But not the kind of silence that's empty. This silence was alive. A language. A lullaby. And somewhere, from far beyond the stars, you could hear her whisper. When you finally stop searching, I'll be here. In your stillness. In your breath. In your sleep. Eternal silence. Not the end. But the return.